Special meeting of the Nacogdoches Independent School District Board of Trustees. Let the record show that a quorum of the board members is present, and that notice of this meeting has been legally posted in accordance with the Open Meeting Act. Mr. Steve Green is en route, just running a little late. Please remember that items do not have to be taken in the order shown on the agenda. And join us in turning your cell phones to some type of silent mode. This time we call on Ms. Dowd.
Board members, tonight, the first item that we want to do before A.J. Craybill calls in to do and lead us into Lone Star governance and Board of Operations procedures, I want to talk about, you've heard me mention before, I know, the consideration of and board action on District of Innovation resolution. I told you last year that District of Innovation is allowed for districts to decide if we want to have, if we're out of IR. And so we came out of IR last year, so we have an opportunity to look at this option. The actual District of Innovation allows for many changes in a district, but the district has to choose those options, and there's a process to go through. So I want to make it clear tonight, because I know I've heard many things out there floating around. Tonight, what we're asking for is the opportunity, if the board passes the resolution, to change the calendar, and the calendar only. There's no other options to look at. In other words, we can't come and decide to go forward on looking at changing the calendar and then go back there and say, well, we're really going to add these other items onto it. You would have to start over and go back through the entire process, because there's other items in, such as contracts for teachers and various other things you can choose from to change. We're not looking at changing those. We're looking at only one item tonight, and that's district calendar. What we're asking for, because we've talked to teachers, and one of the options that we have is to change the calendar where we're allowed to go back 1 week before the fourth Monday in August. Right now, the state says you cannot start school before the fourth Monday in August. It holds you to that. This allows the district to go outside of that calendar and start school earlier, which many districts do now. And so we're asking for the third Monday of August, because that will allow us to put more days into the first semester so that teachers can cover TEKS and have more time to cover TEKS before the mid-semester test is given and we get out of for the holidays. We like to finish the exams and send kids home finished with their mid-semester exams, and then come back and start the second semester. So that's what that allows. If it doesn't, we don't have enough days on the calendar to go through and finish and get to the mid-semester exams until after the Christmas holidays. It gives you that flexibility in the calendar. Without this, you cannot do that.
Ms. Dottie, by declaring and requesting that, does it identify our school as innovation school or does not?
If y'all approve the resolution, we will have to go through a process. We take it to the committee to look at the calendar and various things, and then we come back on the 25th, right? Holly, I don't have that calendar. Is it the 25th? Yeah, next week. That y'all would vote on going forward with it. If that's the case, yes, we are designated as a District of Innovation.
Okay. When we're under that innovation school for 5 years, correct?
Correct.
And are you able to amend other
If you're
exemptions?
going to look at any other items, you've got to go back through the process. In other words, I can't say, well, we're a District of Innovation, so let's just choose now to add this onto it. You're going to have to take, like if you chose another option from that plan, you've got to go and get the board to approve for you to go back and look at that through committees. You have to have, it's a process set by the state.
Yes,
And then that would have to be another item you add on, and then you go back through the process, and it has to go back to board approval.
Okay, my next question is, let's say we request to be innovation school for purpose of a starting date.
Yes.
However, let's say maybe next year we decide to add another exemption. That extend that 5 years, or are we still the same within 5 years?
I do not know that. I don't know whether it's just within 5 years or extends. I'd have to ask TA on that.
I did a lot of study on it. I
Uh-huh.
had a lot of concern as well. Okay.
Then I guess you're saying specifically for changing the calendar,
This is just asking for the calendar.
I'm sorry.
That's
But
fine.
that's not, my question is, if we do that, then we're open to do anything else that we wanna do with that, and then we would be classified as a school of innovation,
That's what she said.
right? Is that what I'm
If
understanding?
we agree tonight on this, and then it goes forward with approval of the calendar change, then the resolution is saying that we can carry this forward to take it back to the committee to study with a calendar. That's the DAC committee usually in this district, is in charge of the calendar. And we put it out to the teachers and all to change this date. It has to come back, we send it to the commissioner, has to come back to y'all for vote, for approval, and then we have to send the final thing to the commissioner. We are a district of innovation, yes. But next year, let's say we wanted to add whatever is on there. There's a million things on there. I can't go and add that, just say, well, now we're a district of innovation, and so I choose to put this on there. If we're gonna choose something else, I gotta bring that to you as the board and get approval for that to go forward with it, and then we have to take it back through the process. We're not gonna just add something on, because we gotta go through committees of teachers again, or public opinion and everything.
Yes, public plays a role in it.
Right.
Then, when reading the information, I've heard a little bit about districts of innovation, don't know a tremendous amount. Would feel more comfortable if we had time to really almost do a workshop on what does it, district of innovation
Oh, well, okay.
mean, and the whole premise behind it and all of that.
It's big.
But a couple of my questions, what I'm hearing you say, what I read in here, this would begin a process where there has to be committees, public hearings, multiple steps before we would actually come back, adopt a plan to submit to the state.
Right.
And then the state could either deny or accept it. My question there is, it sounds like it is, a multi-layered process, but you're suggesting that you could have that done in a week and that we'd be
No,
voting
no,
on
no,
it
no,
next week?
no. There's another process next week we have to go through. This would allow us to bring to you by March, the first week of March. We can get all that timeline done by the first week of March. And we would have to call a meeting, which we're probably gonna have another governance workshop by that time to go through our constraints and so forth. At that time, we could approve the calendar that we've talked about. You can't do that in a week. No, you've got to post it for 30 days. You have to do all that process, then bring it back to the board in a timely manner, which would be the first week of March.
Is this something that was instigated and requested by the teachers, the change
The,
of the start date?
the teachers at high school primarily, it affects their first semester. They request, in my talking to teachers, they have said they like the fact they can finish the exams, the mid-semester exams, before they go home for the holidays. Because when they come back and they waited after the holidays, they got to go through a review and then testing and so forth. They would prefer finishing it before they go home for the holidays. It's never been on any calendar, I think, balanced perfectly, but this year's calendar, coming year calendar, when you count up the days, we feel like there's too few days in the first semester by forcing us to use that fourth Monday. If you back it up that 1 week, it gives us more days to finish that covering the TEKS and getting to.
But this is by teacher request, is what you're saying?
Yes,
This-
they have said
this is-
they
this is
like
something
that
they
at
would
secondary.
prefer.
Yes.
Next-
I haven't asked
final-
every teacher, but
final
I'm saying,
question
yeah.
real quick. It seems to me, from what little I do know about District of
Mm-hmm.
Innovation, is it does give you a lot of latitude to do things differently. You mentioned teacher contracts.
Mm-hmm. That's one of them.
That's one aspect of it. It seems to me then that, are we limiting ourselves, because you said if we did this and we only did calendar, we'd have to go all the way back through the process to look at the other options.
Right.
Should we slow down a little bit and look at all of the options in one single process?
I would say for this year,
Make sure we're doing it
yeah.
correctly. Or, not correctly is probably the not, to be thorough, that would probably be the better word.
Right. I would say, okay, the other items, I don't think we're ready to tackle those yet, because they're pretty extensive and they're pretty hot potatoes. And so I followed other districts that have done it, and some of those items would take, I think you were gonna have to spend more time on those, like you said. The board's gonna have to study those items. You're gonna have more time with committees and public forums. I would take more time on those items. The calendar's a simple one. I mean, it's just asking to start school 1 week earlier for days. I would rather move on that so we can get that in place, so we got to get the calendar ready for next year, and then come back, and we can certainly include this into a workshop so that we can study every item. And if anything else comes up, we can certainly take it off and start the process on another item with committees and so forth, if you choose that, because the board has to do this. You have to start the process with a resolution. We allow for this item to be carried forward for examination and by committees and looking at everything and bringing it back to y'all.
And if we get 15, 20 days into this review process and the overwhelming
You can
attitude of
stop
the
it.
teachers turns out to be, no, we don't support
Then you
this,
stop it.
we can stop that
Yes,
process.
because
This
it-
is not a final,
No, this
this
is,
is just starting a
the
discussion.
resolution allows us to start that. So what we have done, because the next portion is the DAC committee. The DAC committee, part of its responsibility is setting the calendar, and then they look at various options. They set the calendar, because it's made up of teachers and so forth and parents. When that's done, normally in a school year, we send that out and say, here's option A, option B, who likes the, votes on it, and we bring it back to you to vote on every year. However, since we've been able to do this now, it gives us more latitude on that calendar, and so more flexibility. That's different than the 17,600, or 75,600 minutes, totally different thing. This just allows different start times, ending times, and things like that, which gives us flexibility. That is all I think we need to tackle right now. The other is much more in-depth, more political, hot than this item. So I would rather wait, study that, and if anybody wants to study it, then we take it through the process. And we have more time on it. This is just to get the calendar done for next year. That's all.
Sandra, the
Yes, sir.
thing about getting the calendar done for next year, my concern would be that if we're looking at changing this to School of Innovation, reading the stuff that I read, I had some concerns about that because we're tied into some things that may not be the best interest of our district. And so I'm just kind of, is it something that we have to vote to do the resolution? Why can we not talk about changing the calendar without having to have that resolution?
Because you can't change the calendar without going through this process. See, the state says right now, you do not have the ability as a district to start school before the fourth Monday of August. We're tied into that. No district can start before the fourth Monday. You can start anytime after, but the fourth Monday of August is the earliest you can start school. Unless you do this, you don't have that option. So we could talk about it all day long, but we can't change the calendar earlier than the fourth Monday of August. With this, it would allow you to go, you could start anytime. But our choice is just move it 1 week to give us 5 more days onto that calendar before the end of the first semester. Making sense there? The other things you're tying into, we can't tie into those until we bring it back to the to the board for study. And you'd have to go back through a process. I
Plus-
can't tag those on.
Plus, those are option, is not mandatory. Those other possibilities, an option if you want to choose or not. It's
Oh,
not a
yeah.
It's not a
Yeah,
mandatory.
no, it's not mandatory. Because you become a district of innovation, it doesn't say you're mandated to do all these. No, you choose the options you want. If you go to TEA website and look at District of Innovation, you will see all the school districts in the state of Texas that have this now, because they're not NIR. And they have done different kinds of plans. I mean, they're very creative. It's supposed to allow for creativity within a district. It's what they're trying to do around the rules that have been given to us. So they've done, there's all kinds of things there. It goes into all the different options. But there are those, just calendar, and that's what we're sticking with, is just the calendar, so we can get it set for next year.
And when can we do a more in-depth workshop on what it means to be a district of
Whenever
innovation?
y'all want to, we can set that meeting and sit here and go through that District of Innovation and look at every option out there that's available.
So unfortunately, Mr. Montoya, I know you're alluding to some specifics. I'm not aware of what those would be, and I'd be very interested to
Well,
be better educated on
when
the
I was
subject.
doing some research on that and we got some information regarding it, it's just some things that we're gonna be tied to, and I don't wanna be tied to something that we may not be in total agreement with it within our school district or within the staff. So, I think we have to hear what the staff has to say.
I studied it.
Mr. Gotti, so you're saying the resolution tonight is only giving flexibility for the calendar.
That is all it is for, is the flexibility to start 1 week earlier than the fourth Monday of August, so that we can get enough days into the first semester. And in talking to secondary, and no, I have not talked to every individual in the district. I have talked to teachers who at high school specifically like to start and get this they want to start and get the test done before they release for the holidays. They don't want to come back and give the test after the holidays. That's been a problem ever since they put this in, the fourth Monday. It's always put us in a bind.
Mr. President, with that in mind, I move that the board approve the district of innovation resolution relating to the calendar.
Board members, you'll actually have to read the resolution. So assuming it passed, it has a second, you'll want to read the resolution out loud before you vote.
Mr. Neal, before you read that,
Right.
Ms. Dowdy, I just want to make sure I'm clear. What you're asking the board for tonight is to start just the process on the calendar change only, but that's not even being approved tonight.
No, no.
The calendar change isn't being approved. The process goes back to the teachers and committees, and you're going to come back and report
Right.
to more details as to what staff and teachers really want in this district, and we'll have that opportunity to say,
Right.
no, and we're not even labeled district
It
innovation.
should be voted on during the first week of March, whether it's a goes or not. And then,
Go ahead, ma'am, I'm sorry.
well,
I read about at least 25 different schools who subscribe to Schools of Innovation. Almost all of them took the first one, which is starting that
the
date.
calendar,
And some of them picked different things.
right.
But all of them took the starting.
Well, but did they do it step-by-step process?
They did, some of them just took 4 of those choices, some of them took 6 of those choices, some of them just took the time.
But they all had to have board approval after being fully
Yes, oh, there's a
vetted?
process,
Fully
absolutely.
vetted, full committee.
Parents should be
Input
involved.
from parents, community, and teachers.
Community should know the calendars, some people have to arrange their travel, their vacation, things of that nature. But this one was the only option that most of the school, almost all of them took.
Because it's just flexibility in the calendar, which is what we used to have before that law came in. And so the next step is to take it to, like, what my recommendation is gonna be is the DAT.
It's not a trap, it's not a trap.
It's the DAT. The
It's just,
district,
it's governmental red tape in the school district
Yeah.
world that says we have to do this to just try to move our
Right.
calendar to better the exam
Right.
schedules.
right, that's
I
all
mean,
it is. And we're gonna take it to the DAT committee, who usually sets that calendar. That's what their responsibility is.
Kelly?
Mr. President, if I could just jump in and clarify and piggyback on what Mr. Smith and what Bosch is saying, is that what Ms. Dowdy is doing tonight, I think, is she is sharing with the board members what she will support. And she's telling this board that she will support at this time a change in the calendar only. Procedurally, what you're doing tonight is you are initiating the process. So by reading the resolution, it will become clear as to what this board is doing. And when you initiate the process, that in essence is directing the superintendent to put on next week's agenda a public hearing. And after the public hearing, the board will appoint the committee, which again, Ms. Dowdy will be recommending that it be your DAC committee. And only after the committee is appointed by the board next Thursday will that committee meet and decide which exemptions they want to recommend to this board. What Mrs. Dowdy is telling you is that at this time, she would only support a recommendation from that committee
Right.
to change the start of the school year, that she does not feel comfortable with any of the other exceptions from the education code that some of the other districts are doing. And so
We
when
would
you
go back to
say
the process.
tonight, what we're doing is only the calendar, it's kind of not, that's kind of a misnomer, because actually you're just initiating the process.
Right.
You're just giving the staff the green light to put the public hearing on the agenda. Next week, you'll actually appoint the committee, and it will be the committee's decision to come back with a recommendation to you, which will likely be just the calendar. Does that clarify things?
Is it possible to hold that public hearing separate of next week's meeting?
It has to be before you appoint the committee, but there's no
There-
requirement
there's a
that it can't be a
specific
special
process
meeting.
they give you.
It could be a special meeting. It's just a tight timeline, so you wanna get it done
It's
as
a
soon as possible.
specific
Personal
process.
request would be a special meeting. I think we've got enough on our plate next week.
Let's pass this first. Okay. resolution to consider the designation as District of Innovation. Whereas Education Code 12.A.001 provides that a district is eligible for a designation as a District of Innovation if the district's most recent performance rating under Section 39.054 reflects at least acceptable performance, and that consideration of designation as a District Innovation may be initiated by a resolution adopted by the Board of Trustees of the district. And whereas the Nacogdoches Independent School District most recent performance rating under Education Code 39.054 reflects at least acceptable performance. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Trustees of Nacogdoches Independent School District, by adoption of this resolution, initiates the process under Education Code 12A to become a District of Innovation. Be it further resolved that after this resolution is signed by the board, a public hearing should be held within 30 days to consider whether the district should develop a local innovation plan for the designation of the district as its District of Innovation, and that within 30 days of the public hearing, the Board of Trustees of Nacogdoches Independent School District will appoint an innovation plan committee to develop a local innovation plan, or decline to pursue designation as a District of Innovation, adopted on the 18th day of January by the Board of Trustees.
We have a motion, do we have a second?
I'll second it.
It's been moved by Mr. Mills, second by Mr. Green. All those in favor will show by raising the right hand.
Can I make a comment? We have to have a public understanding of what goes on exactly, and they know, and that would be only a starting date time, correct? Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, in five, AJ was on the phone, and so he's gonna call back in 5 minutes to start the public.
If I could jump in and utilize that 5 minutes real quick, just to give an update on the board operating procedures, which is the next item on the agenda. And we're going to pick up from where we left off last time, so we made it all the way up to page
8.
8. And so tonight, we will move from page 8 to completion. And then what I will do is I will take your comments from the last workshop as well as your comments this evening, and I will email a revised draft of board operating procedures to you. My hope is to be able to do that by tomorrow afternoon so that you have the benefit and advantage of the weekend to review. And then I'd like for you to submit your comments or feedback to me by email. Ideally, we'd like to be able to have a final board operating procedure document on the agenda for next Thursday for you to actually approve so that you can then move on to your constraints. So that's the goal, is to start tonight where we left off, get a draft to you by email tomorrow afternoon. You guys have the weekend to kind of review the first of the week, etc. And then I'll be able to incorporate those remarks or that feedback if there are any additional edits, and then you'll have an actual final document in your board packet for approval on the agenda next Thursday.
6 minutes.
Will that work?
Okay, to clarify, that from my review, it appeared that the copy that we received with this board meeting had not incorporated our revisions, correct?
Correct, it's exactly what you received last
Alright.
time, correct. It just shows the track changes that basically were made in an effort to reconcile your policy provisions with your board operating procedures.
So we'll begin on page 9.
She said 8.
Can we complete it?
I think page 8 would be section 5 is where we're ready to start.
And we're waiting for AJ to call right back. He will call back if he was on the phone and he has it.
board member wishes to meet formally with any other district employee, should it just be with any district employee? What's the other referring to? If you read that standalone, right,
Yeah, that language actually, that's not in your, board policy, so I'm not sure what the intent is with that language.
Yeah, other's kind of superfluous, because if you want to be a superintendent, you're informing the superintendent anyway.
And I don't wanna jump ahead and, take over where AJ wants to start. But I think at a minimum, F needs some clarification, because I think what you've been taught is that, your questions and concerns need to go through your superintendent, and there really shouldn't be circumstances where board members meet independently with other staff. And so if there are going to be circumstances where Ms. Dowdy feels like an opportunity for you to visit with an employee and have that employee explain something to you, that employee would have a better chance of clarifying or providing that information, then I certainly think we need to ensure that she has the ability to do that. But I think the way it's written is kind of vague.
Well, actually, the way it's written at this point, looks like a board member can meet informally with any other district employee without having to worry about
Yeah,
talking to
that's
the
first.
that's the way
superintendent.
I interpret it.
Yeah, I think we're the same.
How are you?
Okay. Looks pretty good to me.
I may or may not have had an opportunity to kind of explain the language in section D. You can see that's red on page 9. That's statutory. That's new language that's actually in your legal policy.
Should say D.
And I think that needs to certainly be read consistent, again, with your basic governance principles, but for the most part, unless an employee or a parent has a pending grievance, complaint, EEOC charge, some kind of an appeal, some kind of an issue, non-renewal, termination, that ultimately could come before the board, it would not be appropriate for the board member to visit with that individual in those circumstances. But otherwise, we cannot create a policy that prohibits employees or parents from being able to contact you as constituents or as concerned parents to express, issues of concern. And so that's the intention behind that. And again, that, as written, comes straight from the statute in your legal policy.
Well, does that mean if someone was contemplating but had not filed a formal complaint, but maybe they're deciding whether they want to file a formal complaint, they're free to come talk to us?
That is correct. And what you are taught that you should do in response is direct that person to the appropriate administrator, to the superintendent, who can funnel them down to the appropriate administrator or to the campus administrator. If you're able to ascertain based upon that conversation where they need to go to get the answers to their questions, to hopefully get the concern resolved informally. So you can certainly have that dialogue, redirect that person, but once you know that a complaint has been filed, that's when it would be inappropriate to have any kind of contact.
Okay. All right, AJ? Yeah, AJ, okay, you're on speaker in the boardroom. And all board members are present.
Good evening.
Hey, good evening, AJ.
Can y'all hear it okay?
Are you all able to hear me well?
Yes.
So it's my understanding that the purpose purpose of this evening is to walk through your quarterly self-evaluation. Am I understanding that correctly?
We're right now on the board operating procedures on page 10. Nine.
8.
Eight, excuse me, 8, on page 8. We're going through the board operating procedures, then going to the tracking system.
Okay.
So we were waiting.
So how can I be of assistance?
You were going to lead, my understanding is that you were gonna lead us, starting on page 8, through the board operating procedures, and then go to the tracking system, and you were going to do your workshop.
Yes, I'm confused as to page 8 and what?
The board operating procedures, the document that you asked Holly to send, that is the Nacogdoches.
Oh, thank you. Board operating procedures, thank you.
Yes.
I thought you were talking the manual. I was like, I don't know what's on page 8.
No, the
Got it.
Nacogdoches ISD board operating procedures on page 8. That's where,
How much, so the current draft on page 8, just to catch me up, where did that come from?
Kelly,
Can you hear me okay from over here?
Yes.
This is Kelly Karszewski, and basically the board operating procedure document that you have was last amended in 2015. So what I did is I took that document and I compared it to their local policies. Each section tied it into the applicable local policy, and so that's where the track changes comes, and the red font is a scratch through or add or change or revise so that the board operating procedures now read consistent with their local policies. And so what we did in the last workshop is we got through half of this document, and basically I just took questions and made some notations as to whether they liked what they saw, whether they wanted to add something, whether they wanted to take it away. And we were just prepared to do that again today to get us through this document, and then create, taking their feedback into consideration, a final draft for their approval next week.
and that, remember, that would lead into, as we discussed, finishing the constraints, the measure, the progress measures of the constraints we've developed. We couldn't get to the measures of the constraints until the board had agreed on the board operating procedures.
They needed to feel comfortable with what their board operating procedures prohibited them from doing so that they could develop constraints that were consistent with that.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So I'm having,
So if you see something that you feel needs revised in the track changes, or that something is missing that you would recommend be added because you've seen it of value in other districts, then certainly, that would be beneficial to share. That's kind of the role that I played last time.
And then the next part would be the tracking that we have to go through for you, as tracking, the quarterly tracking.
okay. So my page 8 only has a couple paragraphs on it, starting with superintendent or other custodian of records regarding the preparation and reports. Does that mean all of the track changes ahead of page 8 the board has already reached consensus on?
Yes, correct.
Just to clarify, section 4, item D is the part that's in red. It spans pages 7 and pages 8. Has that section already received consensus of the board?
I think that's where we
That's
kind
where
of
we
stopped.
ended. And we,
That's where
we
we-
stopped, I should say. I don't think we got
Okay.
finished, okay?
I think you need to clarify.
Then,
Oh, wait, just one second, AJ.
AJ, Russell Smith, I think maybe there needs to be a clarification. The board has not approved any of the previous changes. There's been a discussion up to this point, and it's going to, when we finish, there's going to be completely amended for approval at maybe next week's meeting or in the future. And so this is sort of the time to get the ideas out, everybody's opinions as to problem areas or areas to make it better. And I think we ended on that section 4 and we're beginning section 5, and I think they were asking for your input as you review through 5 on, that if you see something that you think would be beneficial for us to discuss, change, edit, or consider, then we're all ears.
Thank you, Russell. That makes perfect sense and it clarifies it. Yes, I think it is a great process for the board to step through the document, generate consensus on items, and move forward. Vote to adopt anything until you've worked through the entire document and adopted all as one. So the process you described sounds perfectly consistent with what I've seen done in most places. So this item 4, letter D. Let's just jump into the conversation then. Is there a board member who is willing to say why they would agree with this particular provision being added in? Section D of item 4. I'll take the silence as a no. Is there a board member willing to speak to why this would be advantageous to add?
Well, I think this may not be the exact ending language, but I think the intent or the potential issue is for potential or past or future abuse. So if you had a particular board member with some specific agenda that wanted to use a lot of the resources of administration just to go on their fishing expeditions, but maybe then there should be some way to rein that in or kind of keep control over it to some degree, would be my understanding of why such a provision might be around, which I guess is why it says such directives shall be by board action. So the full board would have to vet it if it was, and decide whether or not it was a waste of resources or not a waste of resources or needed to be limited. I know that I've heard of issues where literally depending on how much staff you have to compile reports and what time frame to do it, even requests for Freedom of Information Acts, it can get quite cumbersome. And I know there's been discussion in the past to suggest that we might have to consider spending more money or adding other folks to even deal with some of those issues. This may be along the same lines, but I would direct the inquiry to the administration.
That is correct.
All right. So what I heard was a description of why this might be advantageous, because it would prevent future board members from going on hunting expeditions or behaving in ways that might severely encumber the time of your administration. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, sir.
I think it's also need to be.
All right. Is there a board? Before I want to hear the other side. Is there a board member who would be willing to describe why this provision might be disadvantageous?
I like the definition of district employee. Does it mean regular teacher or administration?
So if I'm understanding, you're saying one reason that it might be disadvantageous is because there's ambiguity as to the term district employee. Did I correctly?
Yes, I do. I feel like no board member should ask a regular school employee rather than going through the administration. That's my understanding. In other words, I'd like to clarify who is district employee, a teacher or superintendent or administration.
It doesn't define it there, but I think it's, my opinion would be it's speaking to the administration.
Okay.
That's my opinion. If y'all don't agree.
Well, it seems like.
Yeah. So
Well, to
So
me,
one way to potentially add clarity to this would be to add a logical exclusion, and so maybe saying no individual board member shall direct or require district employees. Well, no, actually. So what this is saying is no individual board member will ever direct anyone who is under the employ of the district, and that would be inclusive of the superintendent. What it doesn't restrict board from directing or requiring something. And so essentially my understanding of this, having heard one potential pro comment and one potential con comment, is that the intention of this is to ensure that individual board members don't engage in behavior that that the board believes belongs to the board and not to individual board members. Is that the gist of what y'all are trying to accomplish with this?
I think that fairly sums it up, plus the way it's phrased, it's not suggesting the individual board member can't ask the administration for information that's already in existence or that's already in district records for their own analysis. It's basically saying
Right.
you can't require without full board action, you can't require the district to do some special analysis or to create a new record compiled, because that would be the time frame. Now, I will say, in my experience, I can't recall, and if somebody can, that's fine. I can't recall a situation where a board member has asked the administration to actually analyze certain aspects of things that we ask all the time and come back to us on a certain area and tell us, what about this, what about that, what'd you find out when you compared? And best I know, it's always been done. But so I don't necessarily perceive it being a big problem unless there's really somebody that's kind of going off the radar screen.
No, what I see this accomplishing is that it protects the administration from, as I heard someone describe, future board member potential abuses. I suspect the way this is implemented is exactly as you described, is that reasonable requests will probably still happen regardless, but when things get to be to a point where the superintendent finds them to be unreasonable in terms of the amount of analysis that's involved or preparation that's involved, the superintendent, by this particular board operating procedure, would have the right to ask the full board whether or not this was an analysis or report that the full board wanted. My only other comment on this one at the moment is that this does seem to comply with state statute. State statute offers a tremendous amount of freedom to individual board members regarding district information that already exists. But to our reading, there isn't a state statute that guarantees board members access to information that does not yet exist. It seems to be in keeping with Texas Education Code. If this was overreaching in terms of being a violation of individual board members' rights, I would suggest that. But I don't see this as being in direct violation of board member rights under statute.
Yeah,
Any other comments on this before we start to look to see if there's an emerging consensus? Any other comments on this item?
AJ, Steve Green, that was about to comment. I think that's D is statute. I think that's law, isn't it? It's in the law
Well,
that you can't do that.
so by my reading, Texas Education Code is not entirely explicit in this area. What it is explicit about is that board members absolutely, actually I think it's not in Texas Education Code, I think it's in Texas Government Code, that board members absolutely have documents that already exist. But there is nothing, to my knowledge, in Government Code or Education Code that secure for board members the right to information that has not yet been generated or created. That authority, our interpretation of it as the agency, is that authority belongs to the board as part of its supervisory role over the superintendent. And so if the board is asking the superintendent for something, then the superintendent really needs to deliver that. But it needs to be the board asking individual board members. This simply codifies what we at the agency understand as being standard behavior.
I'm good.
AJ, this is Farshid. I have in front of me a statutory authorization for the board members' request. It says, according to the 2013 bill analysis for the House Bill 628, the legislation authorizes the school board members to request information from the superintendent without submitting a request under PIA, House Common, on a public education bill analysis, Texas House Bill 62883 RDLEG. Does that make any sense? In other words,
Oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense, and that's consistent. That's consistent with what we've been describing here. Is that to the extent that there is information that exists, the board members, individual board members, absolutely have access, have the rights to that, and don't have to go to the board to get access to things that already exist. And there is a lot of analysis of the data, whether district analysis of it or state analysis of it, that does in fact already exist. And it would be inappropriate to have a board operating procedure that runs afoul of what statute affords to board members.
on your judgment, is it unreasonable to ask a reasonable documentation to be provided for the public information or individual coaches, teachers or board members' information?
Can you give me an example of what you might mean so I can be more clear?
I can't think of any, but I'm sure there's something coming in the future that I need to know or have more information on those statistics presented to me or those information.
Yeah, so for example,
The
if
question-
the superintendent is bringing you, if the superintendent is bringing you information that speaks to some goals, say you have one related to literacy, and the superintendent is bringing you information relative to that, and you are wondering, is there a difference that, and you ask the superintendent, this is the district-wide data, is there any significant variance from campus to campus? Scenario, the superintendent has provided you district-level data, and it is entirely appropriate for you to ask for a more specific set of data. Campus-level data already exists, and those analyses already exist. And so it would be entirely appropriate, because you're not asking them to go out and conduct more work. You're asking to make publicly available work that has already been produced and that already belongs to the public. And so if that's what you're asking about, is it appropriate to
Yes.
ask for additional details that already exist, that have already been created, for you to see those and for the public to see those? Yeah, that's
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts on this? Otherwise, it sounds like there's an emerging consensus, and then we could move on to the next item.
Yes.
Any other thoughts on this one?
Nope.
No, sir.
All right. Then hearing none, the next red section is the D at the bottom of page 9. The district grievance policy. Folks seeing that?
Pretty clear.
Kelly advised us that this was statute.
This is absolutely statute. You all could not adopt something that materially departs from this. This is pretty much almost copied and pasted. So given that this is statute and you actually don't have authority to restrict this any further, you certainly have authority to interpret how it's enacted, but you don't have authority to restrict it any further than it's currently restricted. Is there anything that a board member wants to say to be heard on this item? We can fairly quickly move on. Is there anything someone would like to say on this item?
This is your opportunity, board members, to get his feedback on how you should respond to community complaints and or employee complaints, because when you receive concerns, that's always the biggest question that I receive in governance training is how do I strike that balance between, being receptive and responsive to my constituents, but at the same time not overstretching or overstepping into micromanagement. And so if you'd like his opinion about how to respond when concerns are brought to your attention, this is your opportunity to ask.
AJ, are you saying that
Let me take a moment to distinguish between a concern that is raised by a member of your community and a grievance, because these are not the same thing, and actually can be treated differently. If people have concerns, which means they have an issue that for them has not raised to the level of becoming a grievance. If people have concerns, and generally speaking, the work of the board is to help them get that concern addressed by helping them know where to go to get it addressed. So, for example, if somebody comes up to you in the grocery store, because I'm sure that never happens to any of you, but if somebody were to come up to you in the grocery store and say, hey, I've got a real issue, with the way my kid's teacher graded the homework assignments, who would you refer that constituent back to?
Principal.
Hello?
Irvin said,
Anybody?
Reverend Irvin said principal.
well, I'd start with the teacher.
Teacher.
Yes. Yeah, the first person I'd refer them back to is the teacher. And if they say, I already talked to the teacher about it and didn't like it, then the next step is to refer them back to the principal. And so a critical part of the trustee role is to be, the advisor who understands how the school system works. It is not the job of every member of your community to know the ins and outs of how the school system works. And so if they come up to you with an issue, it is entirely appropriate for you to guide them to the appropriate place within the organization. And different school systems handle this differently. In some school systems, the superintendent says, whatever issues you have, send them right back to me, and I'll figure out where they go. In other school systems, the superintendent and board agreed on that the board members would simply direct the community member back to whichever the next person in the chain of command was, whether it's the teacher or if you worked with the teacher and weren't satisfied, okay, now have you talked to the principal, and so on and so forth, all the way up through back to the superintendent and then ultimately to the board. So that's what happens if an issue or concern comes up. Those are distinct from a grievance in that a grievance implies that that someone with standing has a issue that they want to address through a formal process that is made available to them. And so when grievances come forward, for most issues, the board is going to be the last step in that process. Let me just stop and check in. I can't see people nodding your heads, but does the distinction I'm creating between concerns and grievances, is this making sense to folks?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so here's what's distinct about grievance, is that people are, someone with standing has initiated, has decided that they want to bring their concern into a formal process. It gives them the right to do so. It also gives the board the right to determine how it wants to address those particular grievances and what role the board wants to play or not play in them. In some places, the board largely outsources grievances to another, hearing body. In some cases, the board appropriate level grievances themselves. I make this distinction because a grievance begins to imply a legal procedure possible Whereas an issue is just somebody has an issue and have not signaled that they are trying to tap into protected legal protections relative to that issue. But a grievance they have. A grievance has potential legal, potentially imminent legal repercussions. Often advise board members do not involve yourselves in grievances in any way until the grievance comes before the board in whatever way the board deemed appropriate. So if someone is has a grievance, if a teacher has a grievance about their principal, I would strongly caution board members not to engage in that in any way until it reaches the level that the board has deemed that that grievance should be heard by the full board staff. The reason for that is because there is a reading of the law that suggests you as board members getting involved in these grievances at a level prior to when the board has indicated that it should properly come before the board, actually excuse yourself from the legal protections of the district and make yourself vulnerable to legal proceedings directed at you that the district would no longer have an obligation to protect you from. Essentially, you open yourself up to liability, choose to involve yourselves in grievances in a way that is distinct from what you've indicated the process should be via policy. So let me just stop and check in. What are you hearing so far? Can somebody kind of share back to me, what are you hearing?
AJ, it's Russell again.
Yeah.
So I hear what
how
you're,
many board members are with you tonight?
well, no one else was speaking up, and I'm trying to keep it moving along, actually. So
I understand.
I understand the concept, but my question earlier before you called in was basically the way this is written per statute, it doesn't technically prevent a teacher coming to a board member prior to initiating a grievance and speaking to that board member about that potential grievance the teacher may decide to file if you read this strictly according to the writing. But I also understand the potential conflict that if you've been spoken to and given personal knowledge about it and it turns into it, and then you're supposed to be a decider on the end, perhaps you got information through a medium that wasn't appropriate to be on the decision-making panel. So my question for you on that area would be, where do you come down? Because the way this is written, it doesn't preclude it, but what I'm hearing you saying, and it makes sense, you would want to preclude it.
Yeah, so to me, the logical cure for the scenario you described, if that a teacher came to a board member and essentially brought their grievance to be heard by a board member, rather than it going through the proper channels, and then it ultimately does go through the proper channels, that board member would be ethically obligated to recuse themselves from participating in that panel.
But you're not saying that board member can't listen to them before they actually file the grievance. But what I have done in the past is just advised folks and said, look, you don't need to talk to me about it, because if you choose to do something, I can't be a part of it. If you choose to talk to me about it and I choose to listen to you, then you must expect that if it comes to the board, I'd probably have to recuse myself. Is there anything wrong with that?
That is exactly how I would counsel board members to handle it themselves from legal liability exposure.
How is the chart that's there? Is it pretty much? Is the chart per statute too, or just D?
I've not seen the chart. It looks like the chart is just saying, explain your policy.
Kelly, I think that was in there.
But there aren't,
It's before C on page 9.
That's pretty much what he explained.
Yeah, the board member is contacted by a citizen, that chart.
Yes.
Right.
And I'll just, to speed it along, I'll tell you, the potential problem with the chart has to do with if the person has an issue and they've made an effort to resolve it with the person right above them, then you refer them on to the superintendent. If they've not made the effort, you refer them to the person right above them. But there have been instances and times where they're not comfortable going to the person right above them. They're worried about what that person may do if they raise that complaint. In which case, I think it's proper to say you should skip that level anyway and go on to another level. That's my personal opinion, but this chart doesn't provide for that.
Thinking operationally, unless we're talking about a situation where an employee is worried about some type of harm to themselves, they're worried that the person will, strike them or something of that nature.
Well, it's not
generally
just
speaking,
strike. It's retaliation of any type in the employment setting. I mean, I see it in the private industry, and I deal with it, but it has to do with an employee concerned about what their superior how they may treat them, act, do to them if they raise a complaint to the superior. If that's a legitimate concern, which happens in the world, then I don't think you have to. I'm not sure it's proper. I don't know. It should be talked about whether it's proper to tell that person, well, yeah, you got to go talk to them. And they say, yeah, but if I talk to them, I'm worried about this happening to me. Then it seems to me there should be an avenue. Maybe that should then go to the level above, and et cetera.
Do you all have a process by which could ask to be accompanied by a member of HR?
I'd have to let the administration answer that.
If it's brought to our attention that they feel uncomfortable due to retaliation, yes, we do provide that. We can provide that with an HR person, but we have to know that they feel uncomfortable. I mean, somebody's got to tell us, 'cause I don't just know that.
Is there a current policy?
No, there's no policy or procedure. We've done that in the past, though, where if an
So
individual.
there's no way that somebody would have the knowledge that that was available to them? Because it's
No,
not-
it's not written down, no. But if people,
So that sounds like board policy fix. That sounds like an administrative regulation fix. And the key reason for doing something like that is to make sure that there is a witness that a complaint was brought, which in and of itself would be intended to be a bulwark retaliation in the future. It's an accountability check and balance. It sounds like that's what you've chosen to employ in the past, but that it's just not something that is in administrative regulation. That doesn't feel like a board policy to me as much as it feels like a regulation that your superintendent might want to consider being clear about.
Well, my point for the question was, we don't have to follow that chart in that situation and worry about being in violation of a statute. Kelly?
Correct.
Okay.
So AJ, the chart looks like allows the individual to go back to the supervisor, give that supervisor an opportunity to resolve it before it comes back to resolve the concern.
That's part of it.
well, if.
Yeah, you all will have to decide. You all will have to make decisions about organization to operate.
Because if an individual came to me because of concern of retaliation, I'm gonna have to investigate the matter to know even what happened. So it would be involving helping that individual with HR, but you can't, in other words, we gotta hear the other side of the story. So somewhere you're gonna have to, we're gonna have to include both sides. So we would be involved in that. Making sense, they can't come and say, well, we don't say anything. We've got to find out the other side for any investigation.
Let me just check in. Are there any board members that are in opposition to the language in item D? Because we spent some time on this, but I don't hear any modifications being put forth. Is there anyone in opposition to item D? If not, then we'll accept that as consensus and move on to the next item.
AJ, this is Kelly again. I'd like to ask for your comment on, just to kind of piggyback what Mr. Smith was talking about. What about those situations where the employee or the parent comes to the trustee, it's still just a concern, they haven't expressed an interest in filing a formal complaint, but according to the chart, the individual trustee is supposed to bring that information to the superintendent's attention or to the appropriate administrator. What if the trustee has information regarding that individual's concern, but that person didn't want the trustee to reveal their name, their identity? You know, how is a trustee to respond in that incident? Because simply telling the administration, hey, parents are worried about this, hey, this happened, but without revealing the identity of the complainant or the facts that would lead to the identity of the complainant, then the administration is handicapped to actually investigate or solve or resolve the complaint. Have you seen any kind of board operating procedure that would help a trustee in that scenario? Help a trustee and superintendent to work towards resolution in that scenario?
Yeah, I've heard this issue brought up. I don't know this area of statute as well because I haven't read it personally. I've just heard people talk about it. Most of these statutes I've actually just read myself, and so I'm recalling having read them. This one I haven't, but my understanding is that the board could simply, through board operating procedures, or the administration could select through administrative regulation, simply don't take action on anonymous grievances. And so that you just simply can't, that there isn't a mechanism for filing an anonymous grievance. That my understanding is that is within the school system's authority to determine. In which case, if something is provided anonymously, it just there is nowhere for it to go, and so it basically ends with that conversation. But again, that is something that needs to most likely be identified in administrative procedure, though the board could certainly clarify that in policy as well.
Number 6, good?
Any other questions? Any other questions about item D before we move on?
I'm good.
All right. It sounds like there's, if not consensus, nobody who hates it enough to break consensus. Item in C says the board members must follow the same procedures as all visitors to campus. As all visitors to a campus or to campuses. It looks like there might be a grammatical issue. But the underlying idea is pretty clear. Are there any board members who want to say something in favor or in opposition to this item in C? The board members follow the same procedures as other folks coming to a campus.
Nope.
We're all comfortable with that one.
I just hate for us not to have that, because I go to a campus and volunteer, so.
What about volunteering?
I volunteer at a campus. I bring backpacks on Thursdays, and I mentor a kid at TJR through our church. Is that appropriate?
So were you saying that you were comfortable or uncomfortable with this?
I want to keep it because I don't want that part of taken away. I don't want to not be able to go on a camp. I mean, I check in and do all that other stuff. I just want to make sure I'm not over the line.
He's saying he's in agreement with this, he just wants to know, where a board member, what you can do if you want to continue to volunteer.
Well, yeah, AJ, my question is, I mean, being a member of an organization, when we're dealing with issues, for example, to get applications for like scholarships, and I take that to the school, but I follow the appropriate procedures of checking in and stuff, that's not an issue, is that?
Yeah, so my read of this is all it's saying is that you all don't get to be kings and queens on campus. Like you are, you show up on a campus. Like you show up and you check in like everybody else. You put your pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. And that sounds reasonable. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't read tends to restrict board members from showing up, from volunteering and participating at campuses. Just so when you do so, make sure you bring your ID like everybody else.
Okay, okay.
Don't read that to be restrictive. I just read it to be explicit about obligations and to help maintain the integrity of the school.
Okay. I'm good with it.
AJ, to expedite
Anyone
time,
else? Yeah, go for it.
I think pretty much the board have read the procedures. So if it would help, could we just allow the individual board members with questions on any part of the operating procedures to just go directly to that instead of trying to walk through each one individually? Can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. What questions do you all have?
All right, guys, shoot.
About number 7. Anybody have questions on number 7? That's what. Okay. How about number 8?
Evaluation of the superintendent.
Well, I would have to wait and see what the new language is gonna be, since we don't have the new language. And
Yeah, is it
Well,
gonna
the language-
change? Kelly, what was the question
The
concerning
language-
it?
So the language here is pretty straightforward, in that what's in the Lone Star Governance Manual is that what you evaluate your superintendent on, and how that happens. And so basically there's a question of when does that happen? Well, when you evaluate your superintendent is determined by your monitoring calendar. That you would put on your monitoring calendar, here is when we monitor our student outcome goals, here's when we monitor our constraints, but also here's when we do our quarterly self-evaluations of ourselves as a board, and here's when we do our annual evaluation of the superintendent. So the question of when the superintendent evaluation occurs is very clearly articulated in the policy, in the Lone Star Governance Manual, that whenever you all say you do, that's when it happens, and you just put that on the calendar. Most boards usually calendar that for December, January, February, somewhere in that region. But certainly you could set it for any time you want. Thing that Lone Star Governance Manual says about superintendent evaluation is that the items that the board will evaluate the superintendent on are the student outcome goals, and really looking at did the superintendent either accomplish the goals or have they made progress toward accomplishing the goals as defined by the goal progress measures. And the second half of superintendent evaluation is did they avoid the constraints as measured by the constraint progress measures. Really, that's it. The intention is that the board says, here are the things that we want for our students, and we are evaluating whether or not the superintendent has made the appropriate progress toward those things, goals and goal progress measures. And the second question of the evaluation is, has the superintendent avoided the things that we prohibited them from doing in our constraints as measured by our constraint progress measures? That's it. There's nothing more. There's nothing less.
So,
That is what's in the Lone Star Governance Manual.
so we can throw away, I guess, the TASB instrument.
AJ, this is Kelly.
If you,
This is Kelly again, and the reason that the TASB evaluation component was sent, that we sent that to you as part 2 of the superintendent's evaluation is because her
yes, I saw that.
specific contract has language in her contract that says that she will be evaluated based on the GPMs as well as her statutory duties and responsibilities and what is in her job description. And the language in the contract comes from their local policy. And so they have a local policy that basically says you're going to, evaluate your superintendent based on the academic success as well as the job description and your statutory duties. And so, of course, the policy was was created long before they were brought into Lone Star
Right.
governance. And so what is your recommendation on how to handle that when you have a local policy and a contract that says we're going to evaluate a superintendent based upon these two components, not just the Lone Star
Yeah.
governance, but also the statutory duties? You know, where do we go from here, basically?
Yeah, so the first question to ask when these situations come up, and they come up frequently, so this is perfectly normal. So the first question to ask is the employee comfortable with the new proposal, which is to be evaluated just on achievement of the student outcome goals and avoidance of the constraints? And so let's turn to the employee for a moment. Madam employee,
Yes, sir.
what you've agreed to is obviously what you've agreed to in the contract. The conversation is, are you open to following the Lone Star governance model, or would you prefer to keep what is currently in your contract?
I'm comfortable with either one. I'm comfortable with the Lone Star governance and holding it to that, or the other, but I'm comfortable with the Lone Star governance. Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the first thing to check. So if the employee who is under contract is comfortable with either approach, then I think the board can actually proceed and simply remedy the issue through a revising of its policies. Say, here's what we're doing now. Is that we're going to policies, and simultaneous to that, legal counsel necessary will also make the appropriate modification to the superintendent's contract. You definitely would have to modify local policy for a change in the contract. If you are in the middle of going to expire anytime soon, then you may have to do some type of contract, go through whatever amendment process is in the contract itself. If you are close to the expiration of a contract, you could reasonably just say, we are adopting this as part of what will be in your next evaluation on a go-forward basis, but won't necessarily impact the current one. And so you can handle it. To me, the big thing here is just to make sure that there aren't any surprises for the employee. He is comfortable that with either direction, then the board really needs to just make the decision. Do we want to make this effective? Do we want to make this effective on a go-forward basis after the conclusion of the existing terms?
AJ, this is Farshid again. Here at Lone Star Governance, page 22, it states, the board shall conduct formative self-evaluation at least quarterly and within 45 days prior to conducting the annual superintendent evaluation and annual summative
Yes, sir.
evaluation. Is that a must?
Yeah, so what that is saying is that before you evaluate your employee, evaluate yourself.
Sure.
A horrible supervisor, evaluate myself and figure out to what extent have I made it harder for my employee to be successful. And then after I've self-evaluated, then evaluate my employee. So for example, at the agency, conducted, my evaluation needed to come first, and so I was actually evaluated before my direct reports were evaluated. When I saw weaknesses in my performance as a supervisor, then that have grace for areas where my weaknesses as a supervisor may have impacted my employee's performance. That's the rationale behind the board is evaluating its employee, because it's just appropriate supervisory behavior.
I clearly understand that, but however, it says shall. What I'm questioning is this a must, it should happen, or not?
The intention of the way it's written is that it shall happen.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
The only thing
Other questions on superintendent eval?
I just have one question. The Lone Star governance evaluation, is strictly on student outcomes, which is the most important thing. But there's a lot of other things that go into what a superintendent.
That was my second part of the question. Besides going through.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just a lot of other things that go into what a superintendent
So-
does, and that's why I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
absolutely. So-
Having a little
to be-
both is not, to
so
me,
to-
is not a big, huge problem.
So to be clear, the Lone Star Governance Framework is not exclusively on student outcomes. It's on two things. Accomplish the student outcome goals, and simultaneously, did you avoid the constraints?
Yeah.
And so if there's a particular behavior that the board wants to see the superintendent avoid, if the board, I'm thinking about with my own superintendent, really concerned at one point about inclusion of community in decision making. So we just created a constraint about it. And then that became part of the superintendent's annual evaluation because if we did not create that constraint, then no, that isn't something to evaluate the superintendent on. And so you can, whatever you want to create as a constraints you want to put on the superintendent, behavior and performance, you can. To be clear, if you don't think it's important enough to write it down as one of your 1 to 5 constraints, it isn't something under this framework that you'd be evaluating your superintendent on annually. It says, be thoughtful, prioritize, and then make it plain by writing it down as a constraint.
Okay, I'm good.
Other questions about superintendent evaluation? That was easy. Any other questions you all have on board operating procedures? That was the big one that I wanted to cover only because it directly mentioned Lone Star governance. But any others that are in here, because there's a lot of stuff in here. Anything else that folks want to discuss before we move on to your quarterly self-evaluation? All right. Well, President, it sounds like we've concluded with that. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir.
All right.
You can move right into
So are you,
the board's.
and do people have a copy of the Lone Star Governance Manual handy?
Yes,
Or at
sir.
least the pages of the framework? Excellent. So we would start on 40, Vision 1. Is everybody there with me?
It's in the vision or
It's page 40, I believe.
Vision.
Vision 1, the board works collaboratively with the superintendent to develop the vision and student outcome goals. Is that where everybody is?
yes, sir.
Right. Then the first step in this process, every board member take a moment and read Vision 1. Identify for yourself which column represents where the boards currently are. Now, remember, in order to be at the approaches focus column, you have completed everything and does not meet focus and preparing to focus before you get to the approaches focus column. If you completed everything in those first 3 columns, then you'd earn the 4 that's associated with the approaches focus column. And so that's how this thing. If you, in order to earn 15 points in master's focus, you would have had to accomplish everything in all of the prior columns plus the master's focus column. This works. So all board members and superintendent, all 8 of you, take a moment down somewhere on your paper column you think represents the board's performance. I'll give you just a couple of minutes to review that and go ahead and make your selection.
we better stop with 12. I know we got 12 points.
Yes, we got 12 and 15 on the Region 2.
Hold on. Don't talk to your neighbor. Do your own work.
Oh, we've done that in the past.
Yes.
Own work. Well, don't worry. We'll talk about it here in a minute. Your own work. About 60 more seconds. Take time to read through and make sure that you identified. The next question I'll be asking, some of the next questions I'll be asking are about evidence. What evidence do you have that you've accomplished those things? So be thinking about, do I actually have evidence to back it up, or is it just my opinion? 30 more seconds. All right, so let's go around the table. There should be 8 people. Each of you came up with which column you think most reflects the board's current performance. Can we just go around the table and everybody say which column you chose? One.
I'll begin. This is James Irvin. I chose 15.
All right, Masters focus. All right, let's go around the table. Whoever's to his right, go.
Okay, G.W. Neal, I chose 15 also.
All right, keep going.
I chose that 12.
I also chose 12.
All right,
I also chose 12.
all right.
This is Steve Green. I chose 12 because I had to cheat and go back and look to, I didn't have the goals memorized. I knew what they were, but I couldn't verbatim tell you what they were. I knew one was on mastery and the one was on reading and all that, but I couldn't.
Steve, you haven't memorized the goals?
Verbatim?
That's just reprehensible, Steve. So, hold on. Let's keep going. Let's
I
keep
mean,
going.
I know
Everybody
what
else,
each one of
which
them are,
column did you pick?
which each one of them is, but I could not sit there and spout them off verbatim.
All right, let's keep going. Who
Yeah,
else? Who else? Which column
Russell's,
did you pick?
Russell's here. I think for sure we've made a 12, and I think there's a great argument for 15, depending on the interpretation of involvement of some of the other groups.
All right, who else?
12.
12.
All right, that sounds like everybody. So it sounds like everybody believes you're either 12 or 15. So let's do the easy check for 15. There are 8 of you, the 7 of you. So of the 7 of you, if you can, as your student outcome goals and the current status, somebody tell me how many hands are raised out of 7.
What was the question?
How many of us can know the?
Raise your hand if you have committed to memory goals and their current status. Somebody count how many hands are raised.
I can tell you the topic, but I can't remember the numbers.
We'll sell at 12.
Okay, so that makes it pretty easy that we're not at 15. So we're not at masters yet. Why do you think it might actually be important for the board members to know what the
Can you repeat that?
Why might it be important for the board members to know what the goals are?
So we can stay focused.
You know what questions to ask.
You can't keep your organization focused if you don't know what to keep them focused on. If you don't know what you told them to be focused on, an agent for that focus. And so okay, got it. So that means master's focus is ruled out. So let's step backwards and look at meets focus. Outcome goals that you all have adopted. Your hand, if you believe that those goals, the district, and require adult behavior. raise your hand, of you 7 board members, raise your hand if you believe that it will challenge the district and require adult behavior change to accomplish those goals.
All of us.
All right. So that's the one that really so that's one of the ones that really knocks people out. So the other question for 12 is, which data resource, root cause analysis, needs assessment did you all rely upon when setting those goals?
What's the name of that board? Taper or something? Taper?
Taper, am I allowed to answer that board? Taper and all the.
No. Hold on. Don't throw them a rope. This is a board of self-evaluation. We'll see what they have to say.
I answered the question. I said taper or taper.
I just acknowledged it.
I may not get the exact acronym correct.
And then we also brought in Region 7, and Region 7 did a complete data analysis with us. And, because our goals were, first one was on mastery level. We wanted to get the top end kids moving. Then the second one was on reading scores, and the next one was on our campuses, and the third one was on
Graduation rate.
graduation rate. So,
All right. So it sounds pretty obvious to me that you all are firmly, at meets focus on this. So is there any lack of consensus that the board is currently performing at the meets focus level? All right. So meets focus it is. We will have this exact same conversation for each section. Only now that we've done it once, we can proceed much more quickly. So the key thing to look for is what evidence do we have to rely upon that the various descriptors on the self-evaluation have actually been accomplished. So we've got pretty clear evidence that you all are at the meet focus level or Vision 1. So let's go ahead and jump to Vision 2. Each board member, go ahead and real quickly identify which column you think we're at. Which column do you think you're at? Each board member individually, take just a few moments to make that decision for yourself. Then we'll talk about it. For those of you in the audience, you can always go to tea.texas.gov/LSG for Lone Star Governance. That's tea.texas.gov/LSG. And this, you can download the PDF that these folks are looking at, and you can follow along and decide for yourself what things are or get an understanding of what it is we're talking about. It's a public document. Anybody can look at it. All right, so board members. Let's just go around the, let's actually make this quicker. Raise your hand if you are at master's focus.
None of us.
Raise your hand if you feel like you're at meets focus. How many hands are raised?
All of us. Well, all of us.
Okay, so the big question for meets focus actually goes to the superintendent. So, Madam Superintendent, for the goal progress measures that you've adopted, that all of the goal progress measures are things that you have the power to influence.
Yes. Yes.
Do you agree that all of the progress measures are things that are predictive of the student outcome goals?
Yes.
So that's the big question that often kind of trips folks up with Vision 2. I've looked at you all's information, and from my perspective, it looks like you've nailed Vision 2 as well. Any other questions on Vision 2?
I do, as a superintendent.
Yeah.
Master's focus for 15 points. We actually did a workshop with you as well as Region 13 and other people to bring in data to look at this, and it's open to the public, okay? So people attended that chose to, plus we've discussed these at board meetings and so forth. I have discussed them at parent meetings when they come. I don't have a lot of attendance, but I have parent meetings, which we've switched up from morning to night, and now I'm gonna have midday. And I talk about these. So give me an example of other ways. In other words, when it said, to get the points on 15, it says, students, families, teachers, and community members were involved in the GPM development process in such a way that were as broad community acceptance of the board GPMs. So if we have workshops where they're allowed to speak, or we're part of all the process of developing these, and then if we talk about those throughout the year with teachers and at parent meetings and things, what else do you suggest to get points on this?
So really, what this comes down to is
Because that's all it says.
really simple check-ins. So how many people aren't a board member or superintendent? How many folks we got with us tonight?
How many of y'all is it?
50 plus.
It's over 50.
1,800.
Wait a minute. I'm being heard by 50 extra people. I feel special.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
As I was being heard by so many people, I feel special.
You are.
We don't feel included.
So if there, so here, so here's the big question for Masters Focus. Folks in the audience, talking to you right now.
You want me to, you want a speaker? Someone to speak for the audience?
He wants to.
Yeah, I'm going to ask him a question right quick.
Okay, she's talking to y'all.
We're listening.
All right, so audience, raise your hand if you are familiar with the goals that the board has adopted. Folks, is that?
If you are familiar with the goals the board have adopted, raise your hand. How many hands do we have?
2.5.
Maybe
3.5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Put your hands down if you work for the district.
If you work here.
Maybe,
Yeah, I'm serious.
maybe 8 out of over 50.
All right, so about 8 folks are familiar with it. So of those 8 folks, raise your hand if you have a strong disagreement with the goals that the board has selected.
Of those that, if you disagree with the goals for the district, raise your hand. We have 2.
So there's a goal about reading.
We have 2.
But we're the 2 that are
All
not
right.
employed by the district.
Okay, we have 2.
Got it. So out of a group of 50 folks, it sounds like about 20% of them have somehow gotten familiarity with the goals, and of those who are familiar, it sounds like about 75% of those folks with the goals that the board selected. Those aren't horrible percentages. I think the board could reasonably make the argument that unless you have people showing up saying, participated in this, and we think that you all chose horribly, or you have people showing up saying, there was never any opportunity whatsoever to be involved in this conversation. If you're not hearing those arguments, then I think you actually, I think you do have a reasonable argument for suggesting that you have broad community acceptance. The thing that makes that complicated as a board is it's just a lower percentage of folks familiar with your goals would hope for. But honestly, that's 20%. Is pretty normal.
Hold on, AJ. We have one of our citizens want to speak to you.
Out of the people here, we showed up with a petition of over 1,800 people that disagrees with the board. That don't sound like a very good odds to me.
I hear that, so while I hear that, the question that we're talking about on the self-evaluation isn't whether or not you agree or disagree with the board. The question that the board is evaluating itself on
No, that's what I'm saying.
is relative.
There's never been
is
an opportunity
relative
for the community to agree or disagree with what the board has done.
On these?
Yeah.
It's not gone to a vote of the community, and we were not
right,
involved in
so hold on.
drafting that document.
All right, so hold on. Board, coming back to the board members. As a board, what opportunities did you create for your community to be involved in the goal development process?
Thank you.
I was just wondering, when Region 7 came, I think they asked you guys questions.
No, they didn't.
No, it was a board workshop, and we were here and you were there.
AJ, when you were here at some of the couple of the first ones that we presented, the workshops are always posted, and you ask for input even during those times. That's where I'm confused as superintendent. When you announce these things as far as workshops and all, they're open to public to come in, and whenever we have those announcements of parent meetings and so forth, and that's what we discussed, I'm trying to get an idea at what, I mean, as a superintendent, I'm going to say, when you're doing these types of things with your curriculum department and so forth, you are doing an analysis of the scores and all the involvement of what you know has to happen in the district to make those changes. If it's gonna become a vote of the community of what the goals are actually, then our analysis, I'm getting confused here. What part do we?
Yeah, so, all right,
Who's
so.
making that decision on instruction?
So the only people who get to choose the goals for the school district are the board. That's how it all works, and I don't think anybody in the audience disputes that that's the role that the board was elected to play. The dispute that I'm hearing is opportunities for the community to be engaged. Now, obviously,
Come on, baby, ask your question.
so obviously, I know that yes, there was, because while I was there, I actively engaged the members of the community who were present. What I don't know, however, I would describe what happened when I was there as an opportunity for community members who happened to be at a board work session to be engaged in the conversation. But I wouldn't describe that as an opportunity that was specifically designed for the community's involvement.
That's right.
Generally
And that
speaking,
was the only opportunity that they are offering to you now as students, families, teachers, community members were involved in the GPM development. GPMs weren't discussed in terms of the community, the teachers developing during that meeting.
Okay.
You were the only one who engaged us, and in the other meetings, when Region whatever we were here, they did not allow us to ask questions or be a part of the development of the GPMs.
There was,
Okay.
this is the
Hold on.
superintendent.
Time out. Point. I need to direct the conversation back to the board. So for those of you who came and helped out from the audience, thank you. I appreciate you being here so we could actually get your direct feedback. But this is a board self-evaluation, not a community evaluation of the board. And so board, your job is to listen to your community and then evaluate your performance. And so the question on the table is, there's consensus that the board has done everything up to me focus. But now the question is, does the board feel like it's honored the obligations under master's focus? And so that's the question to you. Based on what you're hearing, board members, do you feel like you expectation under master's focus? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Okay, so all there is to do, so all there is to do as a board then is just when you were going through your review of these things, particularly whenever if you need to make a modification to your monitoring calendar or something like that, if you were adopting your constraints, opportunities that you just want to figure out, okay, what additional steps would we need to take as a board that master's focus on? There's nothing wrong with being a meets focus. You all haven't done something wrong. Opportunity for improvement. And so this is a continuous improvement process. And continuous improvement next step. That resolves Vision 2. Now we'll move on to Vision 3 and 4. And I want to do these together because they pretty obviously go together. So far, it sounds like on Vision 1 where it's meets focus and Vision 2 where it's meets focus. So board members, take a moment, Vision 3 and Vision 4, and decide where you would be for Vision 3 and Vision 4. So let's check in. So board members, on Vision 3 and 4, if you just focus for either 3 or 4. Are there any hands?
I don't think we heard.
What did you say?
Raise your hand. Identify yourself as master's focus for either 3 or 4.
No.
Okay, raise your hand if you identified yourself as meets focus for either 3 or 4.
No.
None? Okay, raise your hand if you identified yourself as approaches focus for either 3 or 4.
No.
What do we got?
None.
None? Okay. Raise your hand if you identify yourself as preparing to focus for either 3 or 4.
I got 0.5 on that.
I got one.
Anybody?
I got
2,
You got 1,
3,
2?
3 of us. 4. 5. All right, let's do it again. Raise your hand, let me count you. That's 5.
We've got folks who think we're either does not yet meet focus or preparing to focus.
Preparing to focus.
So let's ask the questions right quick because these are pretty easy questions. So for Vision 3, adopted constraints.
Thou shalt not.
We've already adopted the constraint.
We all adopted it. Thou shalt not.
It's the measurable progress of each
It's
constraint that we haven't done.
There has been some discussion, though, that in some of our things, and I believe our last workshop when we were talking about constraints, that we may need to revisit them, that we may not have adopted measurable constraints, but we haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah, so fortunately your constraints be measurable. They're just the superintendent will not, or the superintendent will not allow. So the constraints themselves aren't measurable.
That's not what.
Essentially
last
a
workshop
value,
said, though.
are just a value statement. There was a version of the manual that had a typo in it. Focus indicated the constraints were smart, but we addressed that in one of the quarterly phone calls. That has been removed. That was just a typo. That was a copy and paste error. Constraints are not smart. They're not. They're not measurable. They're constraints or value statements to describe what the superintendent may not do.
Thank you, because that's where we were getting hung up, is making them smart.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so constraints are not. Constraint progress measures are smart.
But constraints are not.
That hung us.
The constraint is just a value statement. The constraint progress measures are smart goals that allow you to measure honoring the constraints.
So we do have preparing to focus.
We've not, the board has adopted board constraints, though, we have not done that.
Just like,
They're up there.
So it sounds like you
We've adopted
made
them.
progress
No, we've
on,
not adopted board
They're right there.
Board constraints and superintendent
board
constraints.
constraints for the board.
They were both adopted.
That
We
is
got-
right there.
I thought we're still under discussion on board constraints and the measurability of board constraints.
We adopted
That-
them.
Okay,
that's
so
what
We,
we're
we,
doing.
we
So
talked
let's-
about we would revisit them, but we adopted those
We
at a board
adopted
meeting.
those, but we
so
couldn't
let's
come out with the
clarify this.
measures.
When
because-
did you
And
vote?
that was part of my
When did
recollection
the
from
board
the last
vote to
workshop.
adopt constraints?
Say that again, AJ?
Vote to adopt constraints.
I'm sorry, you were breaking up.
When, if the board adopted them, then there should be a date in minutes when you adopted them. So when did the board vote to adopt your constraints?
Oh, well, let Holly look, just a second.
I think part of the confusion, AJ, is that we had done some work on adopting them, but then we had a workshop with the lady from Waco, I forget her name, and she basically led us through the process and said that we needed to revisit those because we'd not developed them correctly and we weren't able to put measures to them.
Because we were operating under SMART. And you can't, that was the whole
Yeah, so
hang up. And you can't, we could
Yeah.
not make those into SMART progress measures. That's what hung us up.
Constraint-
You can't.
Yeah, so the constraints don't need to be, just the constraint progress measure.
Well, even the constraint progress measures, we haven't gotten that
We haven't
far.
got, yeah,
No.
We've not even gotten that
that's,
far.
that's four.
And I think that was part of the discussion
All
that
right,
night, was
so-
we didn't know that we could make constraint progress measures because of the way we worded our constraints, and that we needed to go back and revisit that whole topic.
Well, so first let's answer the easy question.
Well, I would
Has the board voted to adopt constraints?
What was the question?
That's a yes or no question.
Adopted constraints.
Yes, we did.
Superintendent board.
Board voted to adopt constraints.
Yes.
Voted to adopt constraints.
Yes. We're looking for the date.
All right. Does the board know whether or not it voted to adopt constraints?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So if you all adopted constraints, it sounds like you would probably be at approaches focus for Vision 3, and it does not meet focus for Vision 4. Is that what you all are thinking?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yes.
Is there any lack of consensus on that point? It sounds like you all know what your next step is, so I don't think we need to belabor it. I think we can just move on.
Okay.
Is there any lack of
I'm the one
consensus on that? It sounds like your
confused, so I will bow to
approaches
the
focus for Vision
Majority.
4 and does not meet focus on Vision 4.
I will tell you on the constraints, that whole workshop that we did with the lady from Waco was really confusing.
Amen. I just,
We know why.
Huh?
No.
Okay, on the Vision 4, where are we? Yes,
3 is a 3.
Vision 3 is a 3. Vision 4,
Now, we've all agreed that we haven't adopted CPMs,
Right,
correct?
That's correct.
Right, because that's where we're.
That's a zero.
Right.
That's a
hung up
zero.
because of SMART.
we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So
Vision
yeah,
5.
your constraint progress measures have to be smart, but not the. So here's the invitation, the offer I'll make. If you all want any assistance, because I know that sometimes it can be a little bit difficult developing metrics around that, but if you or your superintendent want any assistance with that, I will gladly make myself available, and we can, workshop through that, over the phone or Skype or something.
Okay, because that's where we get hung up on those.
Yeah,
That's
let's
where
do
we got
that.
hung up last time.
Yeah, but it sounds like you know what your next steps are. So we're good to go on Vision 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, folks. We're on the home. We're almost on the home stretch here. So that takes us to accountability 1. So board members take a moment to look at accountability 1 and decide which column represents where you're at.
but I want to get one more clarification so that we get these points.
Yes.
In order to get the broad spectrum or the input, you're just saying input, the board makes the decisions on the goals. And we've got to have the curriculum department saying, bringing the analysis to say where we feel like the holes and weakness, strengths, or whatever are. Bringing that forward and now adding like a public forum just for that, so we get input from the community. Would that give us the points for 15? Is that, I'm asking specifically to get those.
Okay, so let me be super clear on this.
Okay.
Master's focus on none of these is contingent on checking a box. Having a town hall meeting or forum or something, just doing that accomplish master's. So master's focus means that you are doing this as well as it can be done. And there is no linear progression that automatically guarantees that every time. Down to is what kind of work the board and superintendent prepared to engage in to help people understand why these are the goals. So, for example, you have a goal about literacy. I suspect nobody is going to say, I want our children to be illiterate. So I don't think people are going to bicker about having a goal around literacy. But I do think people want to be heard and want to know that their voice was considered in the process. And so sometimes that can be accomplished with, sometimes it can take 2, sometimes it can take 3. I don't know what it will take. But I want to be super clear. Master's focus is not about having gone through a prescribed process. It's about, it is worded the way it's worded for a reason. Assumes that you've got broad community acceptance of the work product that the board has adopted. My guess is most of the people sitting in the audience, if they felt like they had a voice in the process, had a chance to know what was going on before it was approved by the board, their input considered, and then the board, and then you all came back and said, "Hey, here's the modifications we made based on your input." It's not the exact student outcome goal or goal progress measure that they would have selected. Most people are pretty understanding the universe isn't going to be exactly the way they think it needs to be 100% of the time, so that they were legitimately considered in the process. And so that's the thing that you want to be aiming for, not just, well, we had a meeting, if they showed up or didn't show up, that's on them. It's got to be about, did they feel like they were authentically engaged to the point where they're generally accepting of it? Doesn't mean that they are, ticker tape parades for anybody, but it just means that they generally accept, yeah, we understand how you got here and we can accept it. That's what you're aiming for.
Here,
Okay, fine.
Okay. That takes us to accountability 1. Take a moment and decide which column reflects where you think you are for accountability 1. So let's, once again, master's focus. If you feel like you're at accountability 1, if you're a master's focus for accountability 1, raise your hand. Hands do we have?
None.
Focus, how many hands?
What?
None.
None.
Approaches focus, how many hands?
None.
On which?
Preparing to focus, how many hands?
None.
Does not meet focus, how many hands?
All of us. Doesn't-
Yeah, so this one is really hard to accomplish in advance of having your constraint progress measures in place.
Right.
So this one perfectly makes sense. That it's just hard to be there because you don't know what data you're tracking yet. If you all had chosen something other than does not meet focus, we would have had an awkward conversation. But it sounds like the next steps are the first thing is you'll go ahead and that you'll go ahead and reach consensus around your constraint progress measures, and then immediately after that, you should be expecting your superintendent to bring you a draft monitoring calendar. The monitoring calendar belongs to the board. You all will need to approve it, and so you have the right to move stuff around. The superintendent should bring you a rough draft of that monitoring calendar because she knows when data is available and you all don't. As soon as you all get that monitoring calendar, then it will be very easy for you all to very rapidly start making progress on Accountability 1. So where you're at is a perfectly natural place to be, but as soon as you have your constraint progress measures and monitoring calendar, you're going to escalate to Accountability 1 pretty quickly. Any questions or comments about Accountability 1?
AJ, we have already adopted a 16-month, 18-month monitoring calendar. It's the constraints that we have not, progress measures.
If you look at this, and we could be at 4 or 12 if we had our constraint progress measures.
We already have a monitoring calendar.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're going to probably jump from 0 to 12 on this sometime in the next 60 days.
That's our hope.
Constraint measures.
All right, let's talk about Accountability 2. Members, where do you rate yourself on Accountability 2? Just take a few moments to read through it. All right, so let's go ahead and check in. Members, how many hands do we?
None.
Meets focus?
None.
Approaches focus?
0.
Preparing to focus?
I think I had that one. But
0.
Okay, so that only does not meet focus. So somebody give me some ideas about steps that the board will need to take in order to make progress on Accountability 2. What are some next steps that you all will have to take? Anybody? Board members, talk to us.
You know what? We may be in preparing to focus.
I put in, I raised my hand that we were at 0.5 because we've done this self-evaluation. This is the third time we've done a self-evaluation. And we've done the superintendent's evaluation. Not all of it, but we did part of it.
All right, so what's the next step that the board would have to take in order to improve its performance on Accountability 2? Any of you, any of the 7, what's the next step?
I would think that we'd have to do a self-evaluation of the board along with the evaluation of the superintendent.
Yeah, and it's about that time of year. I think on your monitoring calendar, you do the annual superintendent evaluation in January or February?
January.
Oh, yeah, this month. Got it. So you're doing actually conducting your self-evaluation, and then later this month, you'll conduct your superintendent evaluation. Correct? Oh, okay, so that's perfectly in alignment. So it does sound like probably either on does not meet focus or probably on preparing to focus. There was some difference of opinion. Somebody who believes that you're a does not meet focus, why do you believe that you're a does not meet focus?
Boss, you wanna answer that?
Why me?
Russell, what do you think?
Now, I think there was some question because it was a partial superintendent evaluation. As I've said before in these, AJ, and the way these are written, and I hope you're not the only drafter, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, a lot of these provisions and a lot of these charts are subject to interpretation, and I think that's evident in lots of different areas, and it can get detailed or it can be broad-based. And so what I find when we do these meetings and these workshops is that sometimes there's a difference of opinion as to the evaluation of how the language is written and what it intends you to actually do, which you've had some questions tonight, what might actually make up some of these categories and what would that entail to pass these progress measures. And I think that's what we see when we have these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you a general overview. The expectation is that it should be relatively easy to go from does not meet focus to preparing to focus to approaches focus. It should probably take a significant amount of effort on the part of the board to meet focus, and it should take just a really significant lift to go from meets focus to masters focus. Mastery is just a really hard thing to attain, and it should be. You know, we don't, this isn't, hey, how do we give everybody a prize just for showing up? This is about how do we really serve our students in a really transformative way. And so generally speaking, when you're interpreting these, and yes, they're intentionally subject to interpretation, but as you're interpreting these, you should generally have a more gentle interpretation for your first 2 or 3 columns, but a pretty strict literal interpretation for your last 2 columns. Is that helpful?
Yes.
AJ,
So, yes.
this Steve Green. You know, if you look at approaching focus, I don't know, I'm just looking at, when you go through it, we have looked at student outcome goals at every board meeting that we've had. To me, when I'm looking at it, I could check off the first one, the second one, because their evaluation, with the part of the evaluation that we did do was the one on the goals, on scores
From last year.
from last year.
Yeah.
And then, I think we've got a pretty good, I think we pretty well understand the accountability system since we've lived with it for 2 years. The one that I don't have is, the quarterly cost on staff time.
Well, and I question, what does it mean? This statement that says the most recent board self-evaluation evaluated the board in part based on the results of student outcome goals. That would imply to me that we're taking into consideration student outcome goals as a part of the process we're doing right now. And we've not talked about student outcome goals tonight.
So that's absolutely correct.
Okay.
The assumption here is that one of the hallmarks of going from a board that doesn't yet meet focus to one that is really focused on student outcomes is that when you self-evaluate yourself, part of your consideration is, have we actually accomplished stuff for students? So it's actually not enough that you all have done stuff. Essentially what it says is you don't just automatically get an A for effort. This has got to be grounded in, have we actually made a meaningful difference for students? And so you're absolutely right. I think that was Pam who was speaking, that you have to have a consideration here is when you are self-evaluating, part of the question is, have we actually seen some movement in student outcomes? So let's check in on that question. Relative to your student outcome goals, board members, have you made progress intended based on your student outcome goals or your goal progress measures? Have you made the type of progress that you all intended when you adopted your student outcome goals and goal progress measures?
I would say we can't answer that question because we've not really studied that data as compared to what our measures are?
And
We
that's
set the
kind of what I,
We've had some
We
statistics.
we looked at last year's
that didn't
scores.
convert it over to saying, this is impacting, we're seeing this improvement in this GPM because of this action.
It wasn't discussed.
They're just throwing data.
Just
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you,
and she nailed it. She absolutely nailed it. This isn't just about, is there some data that shows good stuff? It is absolutely about, are the things that we said we're going to get done for kids, were those done? And I think the answer that she gave is probably spot on. You don't know yet. And so that's not a bad thing. That just means that you're still fairly new in the process. That's all. Other questions or comments about accountability 2?
we're good.
I would just highlight the accountability 2 when it talks about the staff, the governance cost of staff time. That is a handout that is in your Lone Star governance manual. At least once the insistence, at least once a year, you all take a moment to kind of identify where you at with that. Not necessarily because it's good or bad, but just to make sure that you feel comfortable with the investment that you are making in effective governance, that it's not too small, that it's not too big. So did you all land on does not meet focus or preparing to focus? What's the kind of
Does not meet
the
focus.
board on accountability?
Does not meet focus.
All right. That takes us to structure. That takes us to structure. Take a moment, board members, and figure out which column represents the board's performance.
We can't get any, because we're gonna have the constraint measures. We can't get any points because it's progress measures.
Does not meet focus is the consensus, AJ.
That was pretty quick.
Well, it's all about the constraint monitoring.
Yeah.
Until we get the,
let's imagine that your constraints are in place. What's the next step that the board needs to take on structure?
Well, I would ask, when are we tracking? It says we track our use of time. Who is tracking our use of time? I'm not aware that that's being done.
In the meetings, Holly does.
It says the board tracks its time.
Well, I asked Holly to do it.
So,
Holly?
so
you
it,
tracking
so,
your time?
I'm tracking the time, but I'm not categorizing the time spent.
She said she's tracking the time, but not categorizing the time
I want
spent.
each item to fit in the chart.
And would that not be something that is reviewed if we're tracking it?
We need to
We need to review it
Yeah.
and categorize it.
so
We missed it again, didn't we?
different boards have handled this in different ways. It is very normal to ask its staff to keep track of this data because they're in a really good position to do so, but that ultimately it is the board's responsibility to know how it's using its time. So, for example, I should be able to ask you what percentage of your time last month was spent actually focused on student outcomes, not all the adult ingredients, but what percentage of your time was actually spent on student outcomes? And at some point, as a board, you should be able to pretty easily answer that question. You're not there yet. The good news is your staff is keeping track of the data. Now, you could, whether you delegate it to a different board member each month to say, hey, go ahead and fill out the board time use tracker, which is in your Lone Star Governance Manual. Whether you delegate it, some boards I've seen have delegated to a different board member each month. Some boards have delegated entirely to staff, but then they included it in the minutes that they approved each month. I've seen different folks do this a whole lot of different ways, and so you all can decide how you're going to do it. What's most important isn't who does the work. What's most important is the board spending its time.
Okay.
Any other? So keeping track of your board time use. Any other questions or comments on structure before we move on? All right, that takes us to advocacy. 2 more to go. We're almost there. Advocacy. Where are you all at on advocacy?
Does not meet focus.
That was a quick consensus. What are steps that the board would need to take to improve its performance regarding advocacy?
Say that again, AJ?
What are some steps that the board would need to take to improve its performance on advocacy?
Well, from my perspective, I think the public comment part of our school board meetings is very essential for us to move forward.
Okay, so while that was a lovely feel-good moment, I don't actually think that is relevant to this advocacy portion. This isn't as much about.
Well, I'm going based on what it says here on the does not focus. Said board meetings and the board has not publicly communicated the board adopted student outcome goals, and if we're not doing, when we get the response from the community, comments during regular scheduled board meetings, it gives us gives us a gauge of what's going on in the pulse of the community. That's what I'm looking at.
Well,
getting the pulse of the community.
Well, it would.
There's a very big difference between getting the pulse of the community and communicating your student outcome goals. And so you don't want to get these confused.
Okay.
Just because people come and tell you about the school system doesn't mean you've created an authentic opportunity for them to know about your student outcome goals and have some voice on that. And so just understand that what you're describing is valuable, but it's not this.
Okay.
I would like to say that I would love to have this many folks there when we have our next workshops and have our workshops, because usually we're dealing with 1 or 2 people in the audience when we have workshops that are open to the public.
But we've never been able to talk like we are tonight.
Yeah, y'all have. As I remember, y'all were able to talk at workshops. Now, at board meetings, you can't, but at workshops, we've had input from the people. So I'm just saying.
Do the workshops after working hours when I have a lot more people. Most people that's here got jobs.
They're normally in the evening, I believe.
That's not, all our workshops have been late in the afternoon like this one.
Okay.
It's pretty tough for people who work and have kids. And if we're not helping kids eat and do their homework, it's pretty
We
hard
could-
to sit at a board workshop when people turn their backs to us and tell us to.
We can move it to 6.
Pretty hard.
That's
Hey,
fine.
I'm just
We
saying,
can move it to 6.
there's only one of them, thank goodness for everyone.
I just want to say that it'd be nice to have all the community's input when we have these workshops. That's all.
Good. AJ, I guess, in looking at this, I wanted to make sure, okay, so it says the board has not arranged for any board member-led community engagement activities. So if we do that, begins the focus for us if we do those kind of activities.
Absolutely. And so I want to clarify, this is why your comment about public comments is absolutely off base.
Okay.
Is because people having public comments do you all get to have a conversation with them when they come and do public comment?
No.
No. And so that is not what this is talking about.
Okay.
And so you listening to people does not cut it. You having a conversation with people does. And so that's why I said that's why I said public comments at a board meeting are not what this advocacy section is talking about. You can have public comments at every board meeting. That is not what this is talking about. This is talking about authentic two-way engagement with your community. And frankly, I think the problem that a lot of boards make is they think that public comments accomplishes that. Not accomplish that. So I'm not saying the public comments is bad. I am saying that they don't accomplish what's written here in the advocacy section. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I think it's consensus that we don't need focus.
So one more board member, preferably somebody we haven't heard much from, other next steps that the board could take to really improve its performance regarding advocacy.
Well,
T.W. Neal.
I would,
Say what?
go ahead.
Well, I think maybe, AJ, what we can do is that as we move forward in our meetings, just make sure that the community is aware of it and engage them in those workshops, and they will attend our workshops, as mentioned, large group of people, then give them opportunity to respond, which we've done some of, but maybe we need to do more.
Well,
Yeah, one of the things I've appreciated is every single workshop that I've attended in Nacogdoches, conversation with the community, in much the same way that we did in part tonight. Every time I've come there, you all have been open to having that two-way dialogue with the community. Not every board behaves that way. And so, I would definitely applaud you for that. And so it sounds like you already have a mechanism, is we just maybe need to do a little bit more intentional advertising and say, hey, folks, out these goals, we really, really want you to come out for this. And maybe just that small change in the behavior of the board, which what's being discussed here. But I just want to be clear, having two-way dialogue with your community more than I see in a lot of other districts. So you're certainly to be applauded on that. Advocacy before we move on.
y'all can applaud now.
All right?
We're in the twilight zone right now. Some of us are so confused.
I want to say this, AJ is going to walk us through our constraint progress measures, and we want to do it in an open session like this, where you guys can be a part of it, when we have the workshop to walk through our constraint progress measures. So when you see it posted, please come and be a part of it.
And look, if you feel like you're lost or confused, you're not alone, because when we first met AJ and he sat down and went through all this, it is convoluted of what they've come up with, and it is subject to lots of, and it's not the most subject to keep your attention on any given thing. You really have to dig into it and be a part of it. And you wouldn't dispute that, would you, AJ?
I'm with you all the way. Perspective on a school board will work. It's a shame that y'all don't get paid, because this is actual work, and it's not always fun and ribbons and kissing babies and shaking hands. I mean, that's what some people think being a board member is about. This is hard work, and so sometimes you have to dig into the data, and that just takes some hard effort, and it's not always pretty and super fun, but it is necessary to protect and take care of students.
Mr. Russell, this reminds me of my handwriting. The only person can read it is myself.
I do want to really stress again, when we have work, we have a lot of people come when we have a board meeting, but a board meeting, we can't really have much input. Where we really need people is when we have the workshops, and that's when nobody comes.
We're here, we're just not called on for our opinions.
I think,
That's just
But
that's a difference of opinion, because the ones
Because
I've
you
been
just hear
hearing.
AJ that's been here saying, he's opened up and said, and so,
He's been here leading the workshops.
Well,
When you've led the workshops, you've not engaged the community.
yeah, well,
We're still
again,
learning.
Yes, I
You've-
appreciate that.
you've had
I appreciate
opportunities,
the
Michelle.
willingness
Yeah.
to learn.
I
So
think they
we all
should,
know, when we do our constraint progress measures, that we want you to be a part of it.
We appreciate that.
Thank you.
I do.
I think
All
we
right,
have
AJ,
to,
let's go to
excuse me,
Unity.
Mr.
Yeah.
We have to create
Yeah,
an
and-
inviting environment that they can communicate freely and we respond to them and listen to them. It doesn't necessarily mean have to do what they said or what, they believe, but it has to be inviting.
While the board members,
Yes, ma'am.
while the
When you're doing a workshop, are you making the decisions those days? Because if you're like, here's what we want to do, having a community forum allows community feedback. And then what they can say is, yes, we feel this way, no, we support, we think you have a good idea, we think you do whatever. And it takes just one community forum to do that after you've gone through the workshop. Does that make sense? So it's, we don't sit here through the process, we figure out the end result. You're talking about how confusing it can be, right? So translate that into something that your community can understand.
Well, to be honest with you, to piggyback, we're all gonna be lost. We're gonna get this book and paper and try to figure out some constraint progress. First of all, we have our constraints, but then how to measure them. And we need all the help we can get.
Well, I think when, maybe let me try to read between the lines. When we, in a workshop, we can't make any decisions. We,
But you're working through
we're working through it and we can come up with ideas and we can, but the decision can only be made at a board meeting.
That's exactly right.
So, but this, but
You
the
build
work,
the ground
the
up.
work,
Between those.
the workshop setting is the most open time that you could have it and have input. Cause once we go into a board's meeting, it completely shuts down at that point.
Steve, to correct you, this is a board meeting, it's a special board meeting, and we did take action.
We can take action.
Yeah.
We can take action.
We can
So-
take action, but if we have a workshop attached to it, we can take input during workshops,
Yeah,
part of it.
yes, ma'am.
So to clarify legally, you can take action if you have not posted that you were going to take action. You cannot take action unless you posted it.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
When a community member sends an email to a board member, they should get a response. So you all should read your email. The other thing is, even in the open session, when you cannot answer, I understand that. But a community member who's getting up and voicing their concerns or letting the board know what their concerns are. And hopefully it's a positive way, instead of them being shut down or shamed, which is what's happening sometimes. And this way, you go out and you talk about it in a closed session. As a taxpayer, I pay everybody's salary. As a retired teacher from NISD and a parent whose child in education from NISD, and as a voter, I should have a say, and you as a board member should listen to your constituents, because we elect you to represent us. And if you don't listen to your constituents, then you should not be on the board, and you have a very hard job to do, and it's a thankless job, because you're putting your time and energy in it and not being paid, and I understand that. But I also understand how it goes in the teaching since I retired after 30-some-odd years in 3 districts, and the last 30 in NISD, and the last at the high school. So you need to listen to your community and your constituents, because we elected you.
Did you hear that, AJ?
Yeah, so I heard that, and I want to slightly co-sign on that, is that part of the intention of the board doing a self-evaluation is so that the board can constantly improve. What you all need to understand is most boards have to self-evaluate. This board has actually done it and it's done it faithfully, and that's to be applauded. And so all of this is part of the improvement process. One of the things that I understood the commenter saying is that she really felt like she wants to be heard as a member of the community. And she absolutely is correct. She deserves to be heard. What she does not deserve is for everything that she wants to happen exactly the way she wants it. But I don't think that's what she was saying. I think what she was saying is, I do deserve to be heard. So board members, here's how you help accomplish that. You create opportunities for people to be heard, ties them effectively so people can come out if they so choose to, what they have to say, and then you give them some type of that you heard what they said and some type of evidence of how you used. So sometimes what that looks like is actually literally having one paragraph that said, we heard these three things, and this first thing we didn't implement because we don't think that works, but these second two things, here's how we made changes to implement these second two things that we heard. In that scenario, she doesn't get everything that she wants. And maybe she only gets 1 out of 5 or 10 things that she wants. Just know that as her elected officials, you heard her, and that you communicated back to her how you used what you heard her say. And so I just really want to validate her point that that is what it feels like for someone to be heard. Not that you do everything that they tell you to do. I think anybody here honestly believes that everything that they say happens is going to happen exactly the way they say it's going to happen. I don't think anybody actually believes that, because that's not the way families work. That's not the way school districts work.
But it would be great.
People have a reasonable expectation. Yeah, it'd be great.
AJ, I want to assure you,
Reasonable expectation to be heard.
you can't help but hear these people. Loud and clear. Thank y'all so much.
All right.
We're
So
going to
that
move
takes-
forward.
I'm a person that's
So that
asking
takes
to
us
be
to
Okay.
unity. So that,
I'm
so that
sorry,
takes us
AJ,
to
to interrupt
unity.
you. This is Michelle Peck. We met the multiple times you were here in Nacogdoches. I do want to back up to a previous part of this conversation where, as a board and with the superintendent, they talked about evaluating her. Next week is the meeting when they're doing that, using an instrument which we've just determined the community had no input in whatsoever. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how the board should communicate that evaluation process to us, the community?
Yeah, is using the instrument that the agency is recommending, the Lone Star governance instrument. That's what I heard them saying.
Exactly.
Think that so do I think that the community should have a voice or some type of decision-making role? Absolutely not. The place where the community input comes in, the board is evaluating the superintendent on, is the student outcome goals and the goal progress measures, the constraints and the constraint progress measures. And so the place for community input, student outcome goals and the constraints, and giving input on the progress measures. But once those are in place, it's just a matter of evaluating, did the superintendent make progress, yes or no, on the student outcome goals? And did the superintendent avoid the constraints? So there is not a role inside of that for the community to say, this is how we think the superintendent should be evaluated. That does not make a lot of sense to me. What does make sense to me is that what the superintendent is being evaluated on is that the community had a voice in that. And so that's why you hear the board saying, we want the community involved as we go through this constraint progress measure process. Is what the superintendent's going to be evaluated on. And so it doesn't leave you with a role in the specific instrument, but it leaves you with a role in something more important. What are the things that the superintendent's actually being measured against? That's what you want to roll in. And that's what it sounds like the board is trying to create around its constraints on a go-forward basis.
Thank you, AJ.
Was that? So that takes us to unity.
Yes, sir.
The board members. The question is, board members, where do you find yourselves on unity?
Not.
we're preparing to focus on unity.
Board members, show some hands. Who thinks you're preparing to focus? How many hands do we got?
Oh, just one?
Well,
Well, I'm
welcome to
looking
the
at,
island.
I'm looking at approaching focus. I'm looking at approaching focus, because, we've got, 70% attendance at our board meetings. We've had a quorum at every meeting. The board has set expectations of information provided by the superintendent to one board member is provided to all board members. That's happening.
I would argue though, Steve, that under preparing to focus, while we're in the process of reviewing our board operating procedures, we've not completed that.
You're talking about the number 2 one?
The second column, the yellow column.
Okay,
Preparing to focus.
I
And
got
on the
you.
second one, and this is kind of a question I have that is timely, since we are working on that, I do not believe that that the board policy, I guess that's policy though, not the procedures manual. Do we have an ethics and conflicts interest statement that we've all signed in the last 12 months? And we've all signed it in the last 12 months? In May?
So,
And is that a policy? It says that we have a policy that contains a template ethics and conflicts of interest statement.
We get it in the mail every year.
Is that, so normally such a thing is inside of your board operating procedures.
And that's what I was wondering when because that's the way I took it when or interpreted when I read it, that it should be within the board operating procedures. And if that's the case, this is a timely time to make that happen because it's not currently there.
I think they had a loose use of the word policy.
Yeah.
Is
Well,
what that lines to.
by,
That
by,
interpretation.
I guess then by what Pam has said, by, if you're asking us to score tonight, it's a 0 because we don't have the board operating procedures. But if we adopt these board operating procedures, if you even look at meets focus,
We'll be there.
we could jump from 0 to 9
I agree with that.
in a matter of that quick, just after Thursday night.
Thursday.
After next Thursday night, we could go from 0 to 9 on that one just that quick.
So I tend to agree. It sounds like progress on this. I've got a couple questions on this one. To what extent have board members engaged in giving advice or direction to individual? Is that something that any board member has witnessed?
Advice or
Board members advising or directing staff. Has any board member witnessed that behavior? I'll take the silence as a no.
No.
All right, so that's helpful. And by the way, it sounds like that is perfectly in alignment with the operating procedure that you're talking about. Do any board members, do you have any committees, staff, or give directions to staff?
Do you have any, okay, let me get this straight. If we have subcommittees, like with facilities and so forth, and we have not a quorum, but a few members on there, plus the faculty, plus the staff members that deal with that, we meet and we do prepare things for that meeting.
So advise.
But the committees don't instruct the staff.
No,
Not getting directed.
we're doing it as a team. In other words, we come up with the ideas and we decide what information we need.
Committees discuss what's going
Pam,
on.
Pam and I are on the finance committee, and we go through. We sit down with the CFO and go through that stuff so that when we hit the board meeting, any questions that we may have been answered, but it's not like we're directing her to do anything. We're just asking questions so that when we get to the board meeting, we're not going through the check register at a board meeting.
All right.
What?
All right, so that sounds like your finance committee is being used to do board work as opposed to advise or give direction. Committees that might be advising or giving direction to staff.
No, we're not giving,
No.
All right, so that's just a check-in. So I regularly run across, we'll have a construction committee that, is advising the staff on amendments to construction or things of that nature. I routinely run across boards that have a bond committee that's advising or directing staff relative to the distribution of bond resources.
No.
I regularly see boards with a committee around facilities where the board members are giving direction to staff regarding operations of facilities, or curriculum and instruction committee where the board members are advising the staff regarding the selection of curriculum.
No.
But you all don't have any of that behavior.
No.
They're not doing that, no. Nobody's advised me on curriculum or anything like that, no.
All right,
We
perfect.
stay out of the day-to-day
So those-
operations.
Pretty much. All right, any other questions on Unity?
No, sir.
All right. So somebody can go ahead and do the grand total. We've walked through this whole thing. So now if you flip forward a couple pages, you wind up at the quarterly progress factor. So what is the total for this quarter?
27.
What?
27.
27. All right. So this is a continuous improvement process. The point of this is just to constantly be looking for opportunities to grow. And so I really want to impress on the part of folks in the audience. What you have witnessed is exceptional. Most boards don't take the time to be reflective in their practice. In the same way that we want teachers to take the time to be reflective in their practice, in the same way we want principals and superintendents to be reflective, it is valuable to students. It is actually a benefit to students for boards to take time to be reflective. This board has done that, and so I hope that you all will just join me in offering, a moment of affirmation to the board for actually engaging in self-reflection. Mr. President, I have completed my 2 duties. I hand it back to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you, AJ.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Speaking. Maybe the audience won't see.
Mr. President, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Wait,
wait,
we have to adopt this. We have to approve it first.
Are we
Oh,
doing,
yeah.
are we
That's what
doing,
we're asking.
are we doing an executive session tonight? or
No.
not?
Okay, I'm sorry. We need to approve the self-evaluation.
Need a motion and a second.
I make a motion that we accept the scores that we just came up with. Is that?
The board self-evaluation.
Yep.
I'll second.
Moved by Mr. Green, second by Mr. Montoya. Any questions, discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank y'all.
Thank y'all.
Y'all be sure to come back now, you hear?